Welcome everybody to today's Paraboss webinar. Paraboss is a joint initiative of Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, Animal Health Australia and the University of New England. It's your go-to stop for everything to do with internal and external parasites in cattle, sheep and goats. And our webinar today will be all about goats. So we're going to be talking all about internal parasites, which is a very important topic for goat producers. And I'll just give you a quick intro, Paul, before I hand over full control to you. Paul is an owner of Collier Group, an Australian-based consultancy group that focuses on bridging that gap between research and the farm, which is such an important role in our industry. The group develop industry strategies and manage R&D projects and deliver knowledge and extension to the industry for us. They also commercialise technology and products, helping research institutions bring their ideas to the market. One of several projects for the goat industry has just been undertaken with MLA and AHA, and Paul's going to give us some information and some results from that project today. So it's pretty exciting for the goat industry. There is research being done because there's not always a lot out of there to access for you. So it's great to have Paul here today. So thanks, Paul. I'll hand over to you and I'll see you for question time.
Thanks very much, Fiona. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for your time today. So today I'm going to work through the results of a review that we recently did for the goat industry and for MLA. You can see the code up there, which is BGOA 0132. So if you use that to go looking on MLA's website, you may find some of the information that they've already put up a little while ago. I hope it's all there, but I can hunt things down if people have requests for information. The project itself ran from around July last year through till January, February this year, and I'll take you through what we did. So where it came from. The issue was around managing internal parasites and the complexities involved. And the scope that we were given was to look at the challenges that the industry has and start to understand what those challenges are based on, where are the options and what other things are being done around the world, and where can the industry go to improve things into the future. So some of the key parts of that is areas around the use of veterinary products and the advice that is required to be able to get access to products. Things like withholding periods, dose rates and effectiveness around products. The limited products themselves, meaning that they're overused or misused, and we get high levels of resistance, high levels of product ineffectiveness. And in some cases where we've had very high dosing, we're also getting MRL or residues later in the life cycle that's causing problems. There's those, generally we are having chemical residue issues in goat products, some of them with registered products, but importantly, many of them are with unregistered products. And the rules around those become quite complex because if there is not a registered product in place, even though the producer has maybe a permission through a vet to actually use that product, the residual level in the industry needs to be zero when it goes to export because there's no agreement with other countries on that residue, which becomes highly problematic for our industry as a whole as we start to export product. We also have some producers almost giving up or not treating their animals, which is leading to production losses, poorer health outcomes, and potentially even death in some cases. And then we also have a potential for some areas of the market that are using some home remedies that really do lack scientific evidence, or using unregistered products. And these are not even ones that we would normally want to use. We've seen some quite astounding uses of products that come from a sort of a misinformed background, as everyone talks about Dr. Google, those sorts of issues. And those are putting the animals' health at risk as well. So the job that we actually did, so at the end of the project, we wanted the industry or MLA and GEICA, which is your association, to have a really good understanding of the situation that's being faced by producers. So what are all the actual practical problems and how do they confront individual users? We also wanted to look at the cost and the complexities and the timelines of actually bringing something to market or supporting someone else to bring something to market to ease that issue. And we'll go through a little bit of what that means. Our project itself undertook a technical review. Now, this was a combination of a literature review, but also a lot of sort of interviews of international groups. We also talked to the APVMA, the regulatory body, tried to understand all of those issues that we mentioned earlier. We did several industry workshops to talk to people like district vets and others to understand from their perspective what was working, what wasn't working. And we followed those up with some long form interviews. The end result was a final report, which has been published for MLA. The technical review has actually been published as well. We also provided MLA with an internal report, which is basically spelling out some of the things that we're suggesting that the industry needs to invest in the future. And then we've also done a rework of the Going Into Goats Module 9. So the technical review, it was deep and it was wide. We covered off each of the individual parasites that are a problem in Australia, how goat immune responses work and the sources of the infection, where they're coming in and how that works. We looked at all the different anthelmintic groups, and those are registered and unregistered, including some that aren't even in Australia at all at the moment or have actually gone by the wayside and are no longer registered. Then we looked at other potential parasite control methodologies. So that went from vaccines to biocontrol to some of the really new areas like RNAi and peptide technology, dietary management and pasture. The ways in which animals can be monitored for those pests, genetic resistance, some of the basics of how genetic resistance works in goats and how estimated breeding values or genomic selection could help in the future. We worked through a whole section on how registration would work and the costs and burdens of proof required to get something through. And then we looked at different active options, what's going to work into the future. We also spoke to a number of different groups in the animal health industries around the world to look at active pipelines and new actives. And then finally, what are some of the on-farm strategies, just the knowledge and data package, how are people picking it up, how well is that being utilized? That is available. If you want to have a read, it's a long read, but it's there. And I do recommend it for those who want to dive a little bit deeper. Some of the key findings. Now, these are key findings for MLA. I'll just remind you of that. So we'll come through to a bit more of what I want to talk to producers like yourselves about mostly, but this is what we recommended to MLA or what we found for MLA. Was that the constraints limiting the registered products are really substantial. We've got some real problems in terms of the registered products at the moment overwhelmingly have high resistance issues in most areas across the country because there are only a handful of registered products and they're particularly old and they're not actually even in the best groups as such for use. Overall, and I'm not just talking about goats here, but there are no new drench products on the horizon from any of the major companies. And if they were, the companies are saying that they won't register in goats. And I'll come to some of the reasons for that, but that's problematic that that's their view at the moment. Most of the products registered currently, and we're talking here in the goats particularly, have those high levels of resistance. And those that are accessed through vets, there is some resistance already forming as well. Now, we're aware of that across all the industries, but the goats actually have some specific problems there. The amount of sharing of good data around products, particularly unregistered products, is very limited. And that's because of some of the legal issues. So even though there's been studies on the best dose rates for some of the new chemistry, some of that can't be shared because they are not registered products. And that makes it very hard for vets to access that information and be able to make good recommendations for farmers. Some of the combinations are still working well, but even then, monitoring and strategy is still needed to hang on to those. Excuse me. Some of the other options, vaccine development. If there is an option to leverage what's happening in the sheep industry, that would be fantastic. And we've made some very strong recommendations around work that we know that's undergoing there. Because of the new types of vaccines that have been developed and the pathways that they're using through mRNA, it's suggested that it could be faster and cheaper once those investments are in place to develop things for other groups like goats. And we're really strongly recommending they have a look at that. We'd also like to suggest to MLA and the industry that we need to look at some faster and easier and cheaper testing for monitoring of parasites as part of the actual parasite management process on farm. So we'd like to get the testing closer to farm where possible, so that when you're bringing animals in, you can be testing and at least get some knowledge of what's going on. And when we talk about these types of on-farm measurements, we often talk about this idea of faster, cheaper, or more accurate as being the three main constituents of a test. And usually you can get one or two of those, but not all three. And in this case, we'd suggested to MLA that we could probably live with a little bit less accuracy if we were getting faster and cheaper and easy to use on the farm itself. So this is a space I'm hoping that they'll be interested in looking at. The results that we saw, this is through papers and through other contacts of biowormer were that it's working very well, but it is quite expensive. And it's clunky in that having to use it every day with animals just doesn't suit a large proportion of the industry. There's also BTs available elsewhere in the world, but none of those have come to market in Australia, and we need to look at why that is and what the options are to bring them to market. There's also some work around copper bolus, but it's mostly sheep work. The goat work is thin on the ground. It does work, but there's safety issues with sheep and they can be overused. There needs to be some additional work done there. What we did find through the literature was that a lot of the home remedies have been tested very carefully over the last 5 years and they don't work. So while there's been a lot of talk about using things like various types of apple cider vinegar and all these types of products, they're having zero effect. And in fact, in some cases, they're actually causing some issues. There are some alternative approaches that could be worth investigating those, and I'll come to that in a minute. Access to vets is still a major problem across the industry, and as is the training of vets on goat knowledge. And we spoke to several of the universities that actually do small ruminant work with their vets, and they admit that getting students to take up a subject on goats is actually getting difficult. So therefore, most of the vets that are leaving university have little to no knowledge on goats, and there's not an easy place for them to pick up that wealth of knowledge that is out there and be able to provide it to people like yourselves. We're sort of encouraging whether the industry wants to look at things like vouchers and rebates to try and access better plans. So this means vets supporting farmers in producing the strategic plans on farm, and also looking at some sort of a information hub for goat medicine that would hold some of the information for vets around dosing and things like that for new products as they come through, even though those products might not be registered. There has to be somewhere where a vet can go online and say, I'll at least get a recommended dose rate per kilo, and then understand also what that means in terms of residues. And we're also suggested to the industry to succinctly lobby for updates to the state-based prescribing restrictions that are really limiting vets being able to do their jobs across borders in particular. In terms of the producer knowledge, the access is patchy in terms of who's accessing what, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. There is quite a lot of good information, but there are gaps in that. And then the way that it's presented is not working for all parts of the industry. So what does this mean from a producer's point of view? And if we start in this sort of flow diagram, we say, well, where are we getting our information? And producers do have limited access to registered anthelmintic information, and that's a problem. The products that are registered at the moment, if they don't work, and they're the only ones that can be put onto a place like Parabos, and Fiona might mention some of this at the end, they're only legally allowed to talk about products that are registered, and therefore they can only recommend registered products. So if you're looking to use one of those and you know that you have a resistance issue already, that's going to be a problem. If the registered products aren't working and you have to move to an unregistered product and you don't have a vet that really understands that information, that's difficult because you don't know the rates to use, and there's a potential you can overdo that. So you can get a drench via an off permit from a vet, but what if the vet refuses to provide the permit, which in some cases we know some vets have in the past because they don't have information on MRLs and are worried about some animals being overdosed. But also just being able to get access to a vet is problematic. And then we have those untested home remedies and products not intended for use. In that case, we've had things like horse drenches used on young animals and so forth because they didn't feel they had choices and someone had told them to try it. And we've had really big issues with residues and the animal health side. So in terms of animal health and residues, why are they an issue for our industry? Well, it's an issue in terms of the reputation and the social license. So this means as an industry, we could be at risk of a backlash in the community towards our industry, but also we're going to have trade issues where we can very quickly have trade barriers put in place because of residue issues. And as I mentioned before, the vet knowledge has to be updated regularly. So what rates to use and which products, and making sure that they're understanding the anthelmintic resistance issues as they develop for each active. So some of the key findings from a producer's point of view, gut worms are a major problem for the goat industry. They do actually create really big production losses, and many of those are going unmeasured because of the systems that we're operating. All of the grazing ruminants are obviously susceptible to worms, but goats are more susceptible than sheep or cattle. And this is because goats actually don't develop immunity as they age. So they're susceptible through their entire lives to those gut worms. Now, one of the things we'll talk about later on is things like browsing of shrubs. We know from one of the animal physiologists that we spoke to and an evolutionary biologist that we spoke to is that goats have evolved to browse for two reasons. One is that it enabled them to access nutrition that other ruminants weren't accessing, i.e. they were happy to eat the shrubs when the grass was limited. But what that has done is it enabled them to take in a whole range of different chemistry in those plants. And in many cases, that chemistry has things like high levels of tannins, which can actually restrict nematode growth or nematode production in their gut. So by browsing, goats have actually enabled themselves to be self-medicating, and therefore perhaps that's why they didn't need the immunity, and it hasn't developed in the same way in goats over time as it has in sheep and cattle. By grazing off the ground, they also tend to break the cycles, and goats also tend to be animals that will graze more individually and spread out wider. And again, that reduces that ability for the life cycle of the nematode to continue easily. Secondly, goats have a substantial difference in their physiology. Now, which came first, we don't quite know. But if you want to be able to digest some really complex organic chemistry out of those shrubs and not be perhaps even poisoned by some of them, you need to have quite a different physiology to sheep. And what we know is the side effect of that is that goats will break down some of the chemistry that you use in a drench a lot faster, so that the amount of time that a drench is active in their system can be as little as half or even less. And that means that if you were to use the same dose as you do with sheep, you would be severely underdosing and potentially leading to resistance in that area. But that's not going to be the same for every different piece of chemistry. For some chemistry, it's similar, to sheep, and some it's dramatically different. And that's where some of the additional work needs to be done on an ongoing basis to keep us ahead of that curve, so we know what the rates need to be. And because our historical approach as industries, as red meat industries, has been to just use anthelmintics, there's not a lot of systems development that's been done, and it's sort of come a bit late. In the sheep and cattle industries, it's only because they've had a lot of resistance they've started to get serious about building decent sort of integrated strategies. And that's something that goats need to jump onto faster than the other industries because of the issues I've raised there above. So there are no longer any simple solutions. Whereas in the other industries, and really in goats too, we've just really been sort of sitting with these 5 main areas, keeping the gut internal nematodes out of our farms, because let's face it, the gut internal nematodes on your farm are your issue. They very rarely actually come across borders easily. Even when you've got animals side by side in a paddock with a fence in between, there's not a lot of crossover that we see. And that's where the science has actually been digging in, and it's not the case. Where we tend to have new strains is when we're introducing animals into our farm or moving them around. So when you bring new animals in, a good quarantine process should generally manage that. Then if we were to minimize the opportunities for outbreaks, and with sheep and cattle and larger properties, we can actually do that reasonably well. We can check regularly using fecal egg counts, and we can treat with a drench because drenches theoretically would work. And then you can check for drench resistance regularly. The problem being is that this makes some assumptions that just don't hold for the goat industries. So the no external exposure assumes that we don't have mixed populations of animals, and it assumes that we're not moving our animals around very much. Minimizing the opportunities assumes we've got space for rotations. It assumes for goats we'd actually have access to browsing, because that's a key way in which they manage. And it assumes the levels of tolerance and thresholds, that we've got those and we understand those. It also assumes that we have access, we actually have regular access to our animals, and that we're bringing them into the yards and we're able to check them on a regular basis. And that's not the case for many of the rangeland producers. And it also assumes that we get easy access to viable products when we actually need them, which is also not the case here, and it's not simple. So when we look through all of these, there are some assumptions here that generally are not working. So where do we head to next? The only way that the goat industry is going to be able to progress and manage, and some of the producers that we spoke to are actually managing surprisingly well, and all of those had a very good farm plan. And that's a plan that they've developed with a vet generally, not always, but mostly. And that plan is constantly being altered and changed and updated as they bring in new methods and trial things, but they're measuring all the way through. So they may be using any one of these ways, and some of them can have access and use others, but not everybody can. So things like protein supplements, people who were able to supplement on a daily basis were able to keep the protein a little bit higher, saw results, and there's good papers to demonstrate that works. Diets that contain those condensed tannins, whether that was additives or whether that was browsing, the copper oxide particles being used. Individual animal records and RFIDs were a common feature of those that had good management, was they knew their animals individually, they were keeping good records, and they're actually monitoring individual animals as sort of signals within their flock. Where they were using drenches, they were very carefully selecting, and in some cases, if they had multiple flocks, they were actually looking to use different drenches at different times on different flocks and managing those in rotation. All of the information, or pretty much all the information, can be either found, as I said before, on Wormboss, but or can also be now found on the new module that we've done for getting into goats. That was published last year. I believe it's all online with the MLA, but if you need to follow up, you can with Fiona or myself. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the difficulty here is any of the information that's published has to be compliant with the law. So there's only a recommendation on registered products. That's going to be a problem. You need to get the access and have a relationship with the vet to get what you need. MRLs and residues are an ongoing problem. In the last 3 years, we've had multiple cases of moxidectin in particular appearing in our export meat and in milk as a residue. This is going to be a problem if we don't get our head around it and look at how we're managing it. We only need to have a few of those cases come to light in, say, the US market, which is our most important red meat market at the moment, for them to look at ways to use as a trade barrier. So we need to be very careful and mindful of which products we're using and try and get better information on what they're going to look like as an MRL. Now, I'd now like to throw it open for some questions, and I'll throw it back to Fiona to lead that.
Thanks, Paul. So the Q&A tab is now open. If you would like to put your questions in for Paul, and while you're doing that, I have one for Paul to start us off. So on the Parabos website, we certainly have a way of finding an advisor, but out at industry, you've put such a big emphasis on one of the really key parts of organising all of this is to have a vet that understands goats. Is there a list of those vets anywhere, or a ruminant vet list that you can go to as a bit of a starting point?
Unfortunately, there isn't at the moment. It's something that we've again recommended as something for the goat industry through GEICA to look at, is to have a go-to list on their website, because then that sort of might outlive Parabos or one of these other channels to market. But yeah, we don't really have that, and unfortunately, a couple of the really key goat vets that are out there that are extremely experienced are actually sort of getting to the end of their working life, and we haven't had too many stepping up. So I'm hoping that the recommendations that we provided to MLA will push them to maybe support some younger vets to get to upgrade their training or even be mentored. Because I do believe that things like the telehealth type approach might be the only way that we can do this, is have, as you said, a smaller number of really skilled ones that are helping other vets or can be directly contacted.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, isn't it? If we could have some sort of a network between the vets, so someone's local vet would be able to contact a good goat vet and get advice to help their client. It's a great idea. Next question, could potentially look at, it's a comment, I think, more than a question. Could potentially look at vets registered with sheep, camels and goat veterinarians with AVA.
Yeah, there is a list there, but not all the goat ones are on that one either, unfortunately. And it depends also, so within the different states, you've got a couple of the district vets that have actually sort of taken on and have some background in goats. So you've got one in Victoria, Barron, who's particularly skilled. And then there's Kylie, who works for the Department of Queensland. I can grab their details and provide them to anyone who needs them, but unfortunately, yeah, there isn't a direct contact list for that.
Okay, next question. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, first comment. And do you have any updated data pertaining to antiparasitic registered for dairy goats apart from venbendazole?
There was a small amount of work that was just done recently for looking at two of the most recent products. That was done by UNE, and unfortunately, because those products are not likely to be registered, the data can't be released, but the data has been put in a form that is now going to be made available to vets. I'm hoping through Animal Health Australia initially, but that will at least allow vets to know with the latest products what are the recommended dose rates, because that's been a bit of an issue. and it has been backed by good science done by UNE.
Thanks, Paul. A comment here from Sandra. Vets can also do, just in case there's vets online, an ANZCVS membership exam in goats, and she's currently mentoring a vet who's about to do her exam next year. So she raises the question, how do we get more vets to do their college exams in goats? Thank you.
I think the real question is why can't we get more vets to go and work with Sandra? Because I think Sandra holds an awful lot of our industry knowledge, and we need to make sure that that's carried through into the next generation, because it's really critical. It's not just about the published papers. It's not just about the science done in institutions. It's about the hands-on experience that vets also have, that needs to be done only through really a mentoring type process. I don't think it can be done through any other way.
Thanks, Paul. Comment, Kylie Greentree in New South Wales is with the local land services, and she produces the Browser Bulletin, which has some great issues at the moment on internal parasites. So for anyone after some more information, there might be some in there.
Definitely suggest going to Kylie. She's very approachable. She's certainly helped out in this project as well.
Great. Why are goats poor in developing immunity compared to sheep and cattle?
So our understanding and reading the literature suggests that this is something it's an evolutionary trait, is that they've never developed that long-term immunity traits. Within the breeds, though, there is differences, but not enough from what we saw in terms of the literature at the moment to understand where that comes from. So it may be that genomic selection in the future can help us to select for individuals that have improvement, because there is differentiation within each breed and between the breeds, which is a good starting point for breeding.
Thank you. I know we got a few comments coming through today. Comments that why, as an industry, have we thought about accessing some of the South African vets who have relocated to Australia, who obviously have a great expertise in goat knowledge, and getting a bit of a goat bank for that? And I would assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, there's obviously some issues there with their training versus our training and being on certain boards and that to get their information across.
Yeah, I have to say I can't probably comment on that one, other than to say that I did speak to a couple of producers that are ex-South Africans, and their comments were that they had as many issues as we do. They don't have magic bullets over there that they've got that are substantially better. They certainly do in the meat side of the operation over there. They do use a lot of browsing, and many of them actually plant specific shrubs that they know are helpful. But beyond that, I couldn't say in terms of vets that have come over, other than you've got, of course, Mike Lawrence, who's a South African and works at MLA.
So I was just typing a response there. So we have one final comment that's come through. So if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask, now is your chance, just while I address the final comment that's come through. And it's quite a long comment, so I won't read the whole thing out, but it is following on my question on how to find a goat-friendly vet, and it's understanding the frustration that this farmer clearly has about the cost, and then the suggestions and answers when they're only a small farmer, and it's very challenging for them. And we do understand the pain in that, obviously, and I hope that we've been able to give this person a bit of feedback today on where they could go for some of that. So just wanted to make sure we addressed her comment. Okay, well, I'll just check to see if we have any more questions. Here we go. Based on the findings from the project, is there any plans to develop guidelines for control for the goat industry?
There's certainly been a recommendation to both GAICA and MLA that we have a different approach to where we're going at the moment in terms of just the decision-making tools that are online. given because of those issues around registered products, and the fact that we need something that is perhaps even more regionally focused, really needs to be farm focused. So the idea that we've sort of put to MLA and GEICA is to support farmers with some sort of workshops or something to help them develop their own plans. Something where it's beyond just me presenting to you. It's some sort of a workshopping type environment where you can actively develop your own online with the group and do a bit of peer-to-peer discussion at the same time. We think that would be perhaps a little bit more valuable, but look, we'd be very happy if people make suggestions on how to extend the information. We think a lot of it is there. Not all of it is easy to implement. And people like Sandra Baxendale will certainly be able to tell you more around developing plans. She must have done hundreds by now. But yeah, it works. When people have a plan and they're able to work to that plan, they have had improvements over time. And in fact, one of the producers we spoke to has been able to get his property to a point where he only occasionally drenches, and what he drenches with is actually the current registered products, and he's still getting activity with those, which is fantastic to hear that that's a possibility, that we're not constantly marching on to the next active, which are, of course, also getting more expensive. So yeah, I think there are ways to do this. It's just going to be complex.
Thanks, Paul. Kimberly's messaged in, how can she educate herself on doing her own worm egg counts in order to save some money?
Now, there are certainly some different tools for that. And well, actually, I think that WormBoss actually provides some recommended links to where you can go to those. So actually, Fiona, you're probably better to recommend that one than myself. But there have been a number of different workshops held over the last couple of years, and I'm sure there'll be more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I know the local land services do a lot of workshops as well, helping out people. So keeping an eye on or contacting your local land services and looking up the Paraboss website and just flicking us an email as well, and we'll get back to you. Will there be any more research going forward focusing on plants and rangelands?
I really do hope so, because I think that can be one of our best options. And I'd like to go further and suggest that if we understood some of our own Australian natives in this area and how effective they might be, there could be some really good recommendations on what should be focused on, but maybe even to the point of sort of domesticating some of those species and looking at creating supplements made from them, because there are definitely some big differences between the different species when goats are browsing them. And despite what some people seem to think, goats are actually reasonably fussy eaters. They won't eat everything. So finding something that has the needed effect and is palatable and of interest to a goat is actually a complex choice as well.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And thank you for everyone for typing in those questions. That was a great question time with a lot of good variety in our questions. So just to close off, this will actually be my final webinar with Paraboss as I moved on to other projects. So on behalf of the Extension team, I'd like to thank you all for your support for the Paraboss webinar series we've held over the last few years. You've been a wonderful interactive audience. I love that. I like a lot of questions. And it's been our pleasure to deliver you the latest information to industry from the best we've got in industry and our wonderful presenters that join us month in, month out. We're not going away fully Paraboss, which is a new changeover of teams. So our next webinar will be a springworm update with brown bezier, and it's on the 8th of October. So look out on your social media platforms and your emails for links to that webinar. So thanks so much for joining us today, Paul. It's been great to have you online, and the goat industry is always thirsty for more information. So it's wonderful that you've done all that research and put it together and collated it all to hopefully set everyone on a track going forward.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time. Bye for now.